Hi everybody! Just like I promised, tonight I am going to finally post the tutorial that is on narrative speaking. So, historically in Speech 110, we haven't had to do narrative speaking. We've really kept this class focused on research-based speeches. And I've appreciated that because deep down I am a researcher at heart, and I appreciate an ability of somebody to find really good information to make sure that what we're perpetuating is good and true and validated information. However, once the curriculum opened up, we had the opportunity to start integrating narrative speaking into our classes. So to give you a little bit of background, I have historically hated narrative speaking. When I was a college student, I avoided any class that entailed it because I'm pretty private. I don't like to tell the stories of my life, and I've avoided them. And as a teacher, I also tended to avoid it. So then fast forward many, many years of my life, and I was put in a situation where life got a little bit crazy, and I kept it very, very quiet for a long time. And then I was introduced to a very powerful woman who is a writer. And part of her power is storytelling. And she told me that once she survived her ordeal, and her ordeal was similar to mine but a little bit more severe, she started going to places and telling her story, and that was part of her process of healing, but also creating human connection between people who abuse and victims. And so I guess that ties in where my story is. I come from a pretty abusive marriage. I've survived some relatively abusive relationships after that, and that's something that I've always kept very private. But once I met this woman, Linda, through writing that we did together, she opened my eyes to the power of narrative speaking. And so I was asked and invited by her to go and speak and tell my story the way that she told her story. So she is a writer, but she's also a speaker. When she was 22, she was shot by her then husband, and she ended up in the hospital for several years as she was reconstructed. Her life today, I mean, she does walk and she does have a job and she's self-sufficient, but her life has forever been impacted by the abuse of her ex-husband. So she now visits prisons, and she's done this for almost 20 years now, where she goes to prisons and she talks to men who are incarcerated for domestic abuse. She tells her story in the hope that through telling her story, she will help them understand that when you abuse somebody, you don't just abuse the individual, but you're kind of killing the people in the community around it. So if anybody survived any sort of domestic violence situation, you know that it's not one victim, it's many people. There's children, there's family members, there's friends, there's the friends and the family members of the abuser. And so it's this big, powerful circle that is overwhelmingly silenced. So as soon as I was invited to speak with Linda, I started to embrace my story, and I also started to embrace the power of narrative speaking. So historically, narrative speaking has been something that's been very, very valued in silenced cultures. So if you take classes in Latin American studies, Afro-American studies, women's studies, there are huge threads of the power of storytelling. And in the United States, we tend to value quantitative data, statistics, numbers, because we feel like if it's a number and it's a statistic, then it's something that's quantifiable and proven and more true than somebody's lived experience. Storytelling places the value or the power of the data on the story, on the lived experience, and on how sharing our lived experiences, we do find truth and we do find shared meaning, and we create community and we find this level of humanness. So in this class, I've really tried to bring back narrative speaking. Not all of the classes on this campus do narrative speaking, and not all public speaking classes focus on narrative speaking. But I truly believe that everybody has an important story to tell. Everybody has something valuable to contribute. Everybody has something important to say. But because our lived experiences aren't necessarily quantitative, they're not numbers, we can't count them, we can't replicate them, we tend to think that they're not as important. But our stories or our narrative are us. They're our sense of self, they're our community, they're our identity, they're our self-esteem. And so our challenge for this assignment is to tell our story. Now this assignment on the documents, if you've downloaded them, it is a 6 to 8 minute speech. For this specific speech for this group of students, I'm going to allow you to do a speech that's 5 to 8 minutes. And the reason I'm doing that is because we do have pretty large classes, and I want to make sure that everybody has time to actually deliver their speech. So some people are absolutely going to reach that 8-minute, and some people are only going to talk for a little 5.5. And I would rather people tell full stories than make up blubber just to hit that 6-minute point. So because of time constraints, we're gonna create that bubble a little bit for you guys. But for this speech, your job is to tell your story. Now, everybody's story is important. Everybody's story is valuable. Everybody has something that they need to share. So there's a couple of important things that I want you to think of. Your story does not have to do with something as ugly as domestic violence. It doesn't necessarily have to do with death or loss or suffering or struggling. It doesn't have to do with any of that. These speeches are telling your story and what's your aha moment. So this is definitely not Oprah Winfrey aha moments. It really has to do with what's a time in your life where all of a sudden you saw the world a little bit differently. So for me, my story is not necessarily inherently surviving domestic abuse. It has to do with finding my voice to be willing to tell those stories. And so if I was going to give this speech, I probably wouldn't talk about my marriage. I probably wouldn't talk about other relationships I've had after that. But I would talk about how important it was when I decided that my story counted and that by telling my story, I could positively impact other people. And I have found that in telling my story, I have given other people voices, because it's not often that well-educated white middle-class women suffer from domestic violence. That's not really what we're exposed through to the media. So your job is to talk about what is your aha moment. So it could be a relationship you had with somebody, maybe the significance of a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or somebody you met. I've heard speeches on how people have met people one time in a grocery store and something that somebody told them changed the way that they valued life, or they understood money, or they understood the value of an education. So your job is to tell us what's your story, what makes you who you are today. Now, like other speeches in this class, I'm telling you the same thing. Don't overthink it. Everybody's story is important. Your story is important. If your aha moment was a day you took Algebra 2 and you realized, dang, like, I love this. This is where my future is. Tell us that story. What changed in you? So, like all your speeches, this speech has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. You do not have to have supporting evidence in this outside of your lived details. You don't have to go and do research. Some people do integrate research. So, gosh, quite a while ago, somebody told the story of surviving the 1989 earthquake. So a lot of you guys weren't alive, but it was a very big earthquake for those of us that were around. So she did have citations about the 1989 earthquake because it helped create the context. If your lived experience does not have citations, don't put them in there because you don't have to have them. Your supporting evidence for your story is details of your story. So a good story is vivid. It gives us details. It's not superficial. It's not just the frosting on the cake. It's the cake and the frosting and the sprinkles and the decorations and maybe the birthday candle. It's all of us, because the more we can experience what you experienced through your eyes and your words and your language, the more powerful your speech is going to be. So make sure you're downloading the narrative speaking packet. It details the assignment a little bit more for you. It spells it out a little bit more for you. And it gives you a grading rubric. And it also gives you a model outline for what a narrative speech looks like. Now, again, it's just a model outline. It is not the most perfect outline on the planet, but it gives you an idea of what your outline should look like and how you can organize the details of your lived event. Questions that frequently pop up are, does it have to be true? Absolutely. We can't tell the power of a lived experience if nobody really lived it. So the stories that people make up tend to come across as superficial, as false, as unempowering, as kind of boring, and yeah, like we know you made it up. Can you tell somebody else's experience? You can tell how you were impacted by somebody else's experience. So an example of that would be, I grew up with a sister who was bipolar, and she went through periods of life where she was epic buckets of crazy. We'd go into Safeway and she'd be throwing bread. Like, that's not normal, right? And by the way, she's totally healthy, normal. I haven't seen her throw bread in at least 15 years. So I can't tell the story of what it's like to be somebody growing up bipolar, because that's not my story. I can tell the story of the impact it was like, or what life was like growing up with somebody who was bipolar. That part's my story. Being bipolar is not my story. So you can talk about people and their influence on you. You can talk about your lived experiences and be authentic. Because if it's a story that you want to tell, because it helps you identify who you are, then give us the details on it. Paint the picture deeply and richly for us. Because the power of a narrative speech truly is in it being honest and authentic, and sometimes a little bit raw, because lived experiences are often very, very raw. But it's also those raw details that create that human connection between us. So if we're missing those pieces, you might not have a very powerful story to share. And my experience tells me that when we're telling those stories that are a little bit superficial, we're either lying to ourselves about the power of the story, or we're not ready to talk about the story. So here's a couple of things. If you're just not being honest with yourself, then it's time for some introspection. Dig a little bit deeper. If you're not being honest with yourself because you're not ready to be honest with yourself, pick a different speech. That's totally okay. If you're not ready to work through it, then you're not ready to work through it. Totally fair, because it's your story. You get to own it. You get to design it and detail it the way that makes the most sense for you. So find your story. What's your aha moment? What makes you who you are today? What's something that made you change your perspective from X until Y? Follow the model format. You still have to use a speaking outline for this, even though it's your story. And I can guarantee for this speech, if you don't have structure to it, you are just going to go on and on and on and on and on, because it's your story and you can talk about it forever. So you got to be structured, because you do only have up to 8 minutes before you have to be cut off. So download the speakers packet. Let me know when you have questions. Bring questions to class. This is one of my favorite assignments of the year, because I think narrative speaking is so powerful, and I think it's something that's so neglected. And I think that if we start to find validation in each other's stories, it's going to make us kind of better people, better speakers, and more connected. And again, communication is about creating that connection between humans. So I look forward to talking to you guys about this. I look forward to everybody's speeches. Reach out with any questions you have. And I said it would be less than 15 minutes, and we're at 12 minutes and 42 seconds, and so I'm signing off. Have a beautiful evening.